So, first of all, thank you so much, Dinah, for joining us today from the Climate Council. I'm going to say your title wrong. Are you Head of Strategic Communications?
You've got it perfectly
I've got it right.
right.
Okay,
Yes.
great. And so you were going to talk with us about how that looks from the point of view of an organisation like the Climate Council in communicating the issues around climate change that you do and the action that we need to see right now. So we're recording this session and hopefully we'll be able to get this out to others who aren't able to be here today. But I think you had a presentation that you wanted to share as well. Is that right?
If I'm right to
Share screen.
share my screen, I'll do that. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining this call from Wurundjeri land. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to wherever you're joining today. I'll be covering quite a bit of ground because I thought that you guys would have quite a varied level of interest in different research specialties. So hopefully I can share something that might surprise you or be new and interesting. So I'll give you a quick intro to us because some of you may be familiar with the work that we do, but some may not. And then I thought I'd look more in detail at three main challenges that we have in trying to communicate on climate change, and then just do a bit of a recap on how the Climate Council does this work. So a little bit on Climate Council, we have a Phoenix story. So the first act of Tony Abbott when he became Prime Minister was to axe the Climate Commission, which Tim Flannery headed up as Chief Scientist. Tim and our now CEO, Amanda, was expecting it and launched a crowdfunding campaign that led to our not-for-profit being established. So we're a communications organisation first and foremost, science-based, and we've expanded a little bit over the years to take in a few other, I guess, specific projects. So to the right of the Climate Council logo, you'll see the Climate Media Centre. That acts like a public relations agency and it works with a whole bunch of different types of organisations and Australians across the country in trying to get them to share their stories and experiences relating to climate impacts or solutions. The Cities Power Partnership is Australia's largest network of local governments that are improving what they do around climate action. And the emergency leaders for climate action you may have seen around the time of Black Summer. So that was a group of former fire and emergency leaders who is headed up by Greg Mullins, who's the former New South Wales Fire Chief Commissioner. So we have a key goal at the Climate Council around changing the narrative. I probably don't need to explain what that means to you guys, but this is sort of how we think about it and explain it to others. And really, I guess, with the end goal of changing the very nature of the ground on which politics is played and what is considered possible or impossible today, changing those ideas. How do we go about it? This is effectively the sort of theory of change we have around changing the narrative. So having resonant, consistent messages, delivering those via trusted voices, doing that loudly through primarily we use the traditional media, but we also have very large social media presence. And repeating. We always tell our spokespeople that until they feel a little bit of vomit coming up their throat because they're so sick of saying the same thing again and again, they probably haven't said it enough. I'll return back to that theory of change at the end of this presentation. So the first big challenge that we have is actually finding our audience. Public support is high for climate concern and change in Australia, and it's broader than it's ever been before. Certainly in my time working on this issue, which isn't very long compared to many others, I started working for Climate Council in 2015, I've seen quite dramatic shifts in particular types of people and demographics across the country. But at the moment, we're kind of sitting at almost back to the highest levels we've seen in 2006. So we're sort of returned back to those high levels. And many more Australians than previously are obviously experiencing those direct impacts and recognise that things like Black Summer and the like. This is just a graphic illustration of where we can see those levels of support returning to previous highs. And that's from the Lowy's climate polling, annual climate polling. We think about audience now in this basic way. So 40% of Australians who are very concerned about climate change, they understand the costs of failing to act and they support urgent action on the issue. 40% who are moderately concerned about climate change, they're not sure if the costs of action are worth it or if they'll actually work. And then there's 20% who have low levels of concern or don't actually accept climate science or believe there's any issue whatsoever. We don't worry about that bottom 20%. We focus on the middle section as we think that they're persuadable. So this is a more sophisticated way of thinking about audience. Again, I'm not sure how familiar people are with this, but this was part of a large, I just noticed they spelled Australian wrong. This is part of a very large research project that was commissioned by the Sunrise organisation. 55 carried out the research and Rebecca Huntley headed this up. It was using the same methodology that I think it's Heinz did in the US, but they did a version of this called the Six Americas. So it's sort of grouping Australians not based around demographics, political ideology, or voting patterns or anything like that, but grouping them based around particular attitudes and beliefs that they hold related to climate change. So on the far left, you'll see alarmed people, and we have one or two more Australias that the Americans didn't have: alert, concerned, cautious, disengaged, right down to your doubtful, and finally the dismissive, which is what we would class as an actual climate denier or skeptic. So that, I should finish that work has allowed a lot of organisations to, I guess, be a bit more sophisticated on who they target, and also what those groups of Australians might need to hear, as well as what those types of Australians are actually already doing in relation to climate action or might be willing to do in terms of further steps. So it had a very, I guess, advocacy focus in terms of that. Any questions so far? Or I'll just keep plowing on. Okay. So the second thing that we're focused on is finding the right message. The science story is pretty bloody scary, and it is getting scarier. We are expecting the IPCC to put out its latest report early next month. It's not going to be good news because emissions have only increased since their last report, which is dating back to 8 years ago, delayed by a year because of COVID. And if you look at the latest science and the modelling that has been highly accurate in the past and is looking forward to the different trajectories that we could go in terms of global temperature rise, no matter which trajectory we end up on, a lot of the impacts are actually locked in for the next decade or so. And that's going to mean some pretty serious things for all of us. But it's very hard to sell a bad news story. So the way that we are thinking about the key challenges that we have is around that updated science being read as, well, to use a bit of French, we're all fucked, so let's give up, or nothing we do matters. And if we think about the climate compass segmentation, the most concerned group around that is that alarmed group. So that's the group that have been, engaged in this issue for many years, already have those high levels of concern. They're very vulnerable to this, being either overwhelmed, demotivated, or depressed, or falling into that doomism. There's also implications around whether previous climate targets are actually still relevant, and whether you update them, whether there's that sense of you're actually never happy or you're always changing the goalposts. Opponents being emboldened and weaponizing that information to shift focus to things that aren't practical for places like Australia, like nuclear, or to focus on things that may be required in future, like geoengineering or drawdown, but should never come at the expense of emissions cuts this decade. And just that incredible complexity in explaining concepts to people. So one example I'll give is we recently did a report that was around the urgent emission cuts that are required this decade and what a massive difference doing so will mean. And there was some modelling that looked at the threshold of 1.5 degrees and how we're tracking along that. And again, the latest science is all saying that temperature will be breached in the 2030s, which is really not far away. But people trying to get their head around 1.5 degree temperature versus 1.5 degree target, which may be sort of captured in something like the Paris Agreement, which is measured over decades, not single points in time, and also stabilization, which might involve, a temperature going up and then being brought back down and sitting over time in an area, is just incredibly complex and difficult to get across to people. So we've got a big job in front of us. We did a bunch of research related to the release of that report and how different groups of people might take in the news of this worse science. And we looked at two different groups. One was that alarmed alert, and the other were the cautious doubtful. And we were interested to see how those particular two groups responded, because one, we need to keep engaged and active, and the other group, we want to increase their sense of urgency and engagement. What we found was that they both agree, although for different reasons, that there's plenty of benefits and opportunities to Australia taking climate action. So I guess just that positive story can bring people together. That they think our country should be keeping up with the rest of the world when it comes to climate action. This was where you start to see a very clear difference between the two groups. The alarmed alert audience love the idea of us being a leader. So do young people. But cautious doubtful do not want to stick their head above the parapet, but nor do they want to be left behind. So they start to get worried if they get told that there's these things happening overseas where you've got our major trading partners, our political allies, committing to net zero, increasing their climate emission targets for this decade. They automatically go, oh, okay, well, that's pretty serious for Australia. They understand that we as a trading nation and a small nation rely on others for our prosperity. And erasing economic impacts particularly, creates that sense of urgency. So I think this week we're expecting some more information on the European Union trade tariffs and And that is a really critical story to tell Australians. So here you can see the percentages around who thought what. The blue key is cut off, but basically that was Australia should just worry about itself and should just do what it likes and don't worry about what anyone else is doing. In terms of net zero, I was actually amazed that people broadly understand what that means. I thought it would just be another concept that would be very difficult. So that was interesting. They aren't tied to any particular date. We've ourselves and others have asked people, you know, do you think Australia should reach net zero by 2050? Do you think it should reach it by 2040? Do you think it should reach it by 2035? It actually makes little difference to people in terms of the year and the amounts of people that agree with that. And when we talked about this in focus groups, they thought we should reach it sooner if we could. What was also very clear was when you started talking about faraway dates like net zero by 2050, those more cautious and less concerned audiences actually thought, oh yeah, this issue isn't that important. So talking about this year and this decade is much, much more critical in engaging with those less concerned audiences than any kind of eventual target or date that you want to get to. Responsibility is an interesting one. Most people overemphasize the responsibility of individuals. The public relations work that many companies do to push responsibility back on individuals is clearly working very well. And they see climate action very much as shared responsibility between individuals, governments, and businesses as well. What's more interesting is that most people have no sense of what the government actually is doing or isn't doing. And I think that's certainly reflects poorly on organisations like ours, where we haven't done a good enough job to articulate what climate action actually looks like and what credible climate action actually looks like, and holding the government to account on whether or not they reach that mark. They can't differentiate between the major parties. The only differences between the group is that the more concerned assume that the government's doing badly, whereas the less concerned assume that they're doing just fine. But everyone thinks we can and should be doing more, which is positive. So I mentioned positive and inclusive, positive story, positive and inclusive language really connects with those less engaged audiences. I had thought that the, where did I have it? So the risks and threats of climate change do engage already concerned audiences, but they certainly deter those that are less engaged. We also were curious, this is more of a side thing, but we were curious around whether using different terms made any difference. So global warming, we found, worked across audiences. Climate crisis is polarizing, just like the climate emergency. And climate change is unappealing across the board, but for different reasons. So climate change doesn't reflect the worldview of the alarmed audiences, because they're like, this is serious. This climate change doesn't sound as serious as what's going on. For the less engaged, they say, well, climate change could be anything, and it doesn't say that humans are responsible. Whereas global warming had a similar impact on people in both groups, where they can imagine immediately the impacts of that, most commonly heat waves, droughts, and bushfires. So what's our solution? We think people are open to the idea of us acting fast and together, you know, collectively around a science-based goal. I think it's changed over time potentially, but certainly Australia had an initial really positive experience via COVID to see what difference it meant to act quickly and decisively earlier in the piece. growing international momentum is a big motivator, so that's something that we try to do as much as possible, whether that's talking about the risks of inaction to Australia or around those opportunities, benefits from acting as early as possible. We always encourage the people we work with to talk about what motivates them, because people have different motivations, and connecting with others. If we have lots of different people talking about lots of different motivations, that's where we'll make the most connections. So values being front and center rather than any fixation on numbers in effect, targets or policies. We talk about degrees of danger. There's been a lot of focus on 1.5 because of the international events around Paris. And it's given the impression that we have a choice between that miracle of staying under 1.5 or apocalypse, neither of which are going to actually eventuate anytime soon. A better sort of analogy that I read was from Kate Marvel, where she was talking about it not being a cliff but a slope. There is some caveats to that. The climate scientists will say if we reach certain thresholds, there will be irreversible changes. But there is no question that we have an opportunity to improve things always, or we have an opportunity to make them worse. Giving people confidence. We're talking about a pretty big deal here. It's never been done. And while people are generally supportive of lots of things that we propose need to happen, most to all of them need confidence that it can actually be done. And we do that through talking as much as possible and helping them visualize and see the positive things that are already underway and the progress that's already been made. In a separate bit of research we did around some barriers to support of renewables, it was really incredible to see the change in people once you actually said to them, hey, did you know this has already occurred? And then they were suddenly like, oh, well then, yeah, we should definitely do that other thing you're talking about. But when you just said, hey, do that other thing, like 100% renewables, they were like, oh, maybe, but it's probably not really going to happen. And the other thing is around avoiding that loss and doomism framing, because it's really demotivating and debilitating for lots of different audiences. Just pause there in case you want to flag anything before I jump to the next bit. Okay.
I might have questions after, but it's fascinating, so keep going.
Okay, good. And so the last one I wanted to touch on was finding the right messenger. This is Anika Molesworth, who is a delightful young farmer from New South Wales. So the Monash Climate Change Communications Research Hub has done lots of different studies that I guess look at trusted messengers. And they have found that climate scientists, farmers, firefighters, and funnily enough, weather presenters are the most trusted. The Climate Council sort of started off with climate scientists, and it expanded its network of experts to move beyond climate science specifically to looking at people that can speak with authority on climate impacts and also climate solutions, most predominantly in energy, because the transformation of the energy system was the first and easiest to tackle. Through the Climate Media Centre, we actually work with a huge number of different groups that we would consider trusted voices, depending on the audience they're speaking to and the situation in which they're speaking. So they're based all around the country. That includes farmers. So we work with a particular group called Farmers for Climate Action. Doctors and nurses. So there's Doctors for the Environment, and the Climate and Health Alliance that are very active. There's also unions like the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation. We work with firefighters and emergency service personnel, most predominantly with that emergency leaders for climate action I mentioned. Children, so we've done some work with the climate strikers, and also there's a group called Parents for Climate Action. We have done work with athletes. There's a number of different groups that operate in Australia that include athletes that are concerned about climate change. We work with entrepreneurs, like people that are starting new businesses or, have clever ideas that can kind of help with solve the problem, and also leaders in business that are doing good work, and workers themselves, just more broadly, particularly those that might be working in the newer growing industries. But we kind of look at this as the more the merrier. I think, you can never have too many people who are speaking out and visible in that media environment. We also have, as I mentioned, the Cities Power Partnership. So I think they're up to about 147 or 8 member councils. And so they work with spokespeople, most usually mayors of particular council areas, or councillors of those local government areas. But community leaders are obviously a really important part of the picture as well. So going back to this, how do we change the narrative, and our theory of change? This is sort of where all the, I guess, pieces fit in. So on the left, you'll see we put a lot of effort into how we develop messages, including, I guess, keeping up to date with the research that's being done in Australia and overseas, doing some ourselves, and also just working really closely with our spokespeople on that. We have the Cities Power Partnership and the Climate Media Centre that kind of identify, train, and pitch out relatable spokespeople. And we also have a cohort of, we call councillors, that sit under the Climate Council branding. In terms of loudly, so in any given year, we would do tens of thousands of media items, not necessarily under our branding, but that includes the media centre's work as well. And we have a pretty large social media presence as the Climate Council, something in relation to 5 million or something reach. And in terms of repetition, so we try to concentrate on particular areas so that we can get that repetition, and hopefully multiple exposures for audiences of hearing that same message coming through, potentially from different people or potentially from recognisable, familiar people. And that is it. I'll just stop sharing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Such a comprehensive and fascinating presentation. And I probably didn't adequately apologise at the beginning for the technical hitches that we just wanted to get you started. So many apologies for that. But you completely drowned that out with your wonderful presentation. So thank you. I've got questions. I'm sure others have too. Did anyone want to jump in with a question?
I might, if that's okay, Gabby. Dana, thank you so much. It's a fascinating presentation. It's very generous of you to share it with us. I found it really interesting that on the list of trusted people is an absence of scientists and academics. So, I mean, is it so that now that sort of space is just too tainted in terms of the debate, that whole idea that there should be balance and, and that kind of narrative, and that kind of also the increasing democratization of expertise, where all these voices are kind of meant to be read on an equal kind of platform, if that makes sense. So I guess my question is, why are scientists and academics not part of the trusted group?
Oh, they most definitely are. I probably didn't make that clear enough. So this is people that we consider trusted outside of the Climate Council.
Yeah, no, that's
so
what I mean. Sorry. So I mean, not by you, Ross, you wouldn't have given us your time today, but by the public.
No, I would say, if anything, I actually think they are highly trusted. So you notice that, nurses and doctors are on there as well. I think it's experts are trusted, definitely. I think that people don't trust politicians, but they do pay attention to them. So that is part of the reason why we find ourselves in this situation, because we have lots of high-profile, problematic politicians in this country. But I would say finding experts who can communicate in a I don't want to say simple, but in a straightforward, clear way, that is really hard to find. There aren't a lot. Certainly the Media Centre as well does work with experts. So we have a few areas, for example, in gas, just to give one, where we would have academics, we would have people with highly qualified people that are talking to an expertise. But I think finding or training up people to be in a position where they can use that expertise to reach everyday people, I think they're quite rare. Yeah.
It's good to hear that there is some space still of sort of trusting that.
Oh, definitely.
Voice,
And I think the media by and large always look for that. And I think audiences definitely listen to that. And I think if anything, I think again, COVID has probably meant we do it even more than we did potentially. It was being eroded to a degree before that happened.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Gabby, I have just a question. Thanks. I'll turn my video off for the bad reception. Dinah, thanks for that great presentation. I wondered, you said the word story a couple of times, and so I just wondered any comments on the role of telling these stories as and how we do that as joining the comms communication, the comms messages that you're giving.
Yeah, I think we remember things primarily through stories, and so I think stories are incredibly important. So again, we always encourage our spokespeople to think about, like paint a picture of where you are or where you were, what happened, how it felt, how it looked, and using anecdotes, using those kind of things, I think are incredibly important just as part of that communication. Yeah.
Thanks, Dinah. Can I jump in with a question? So my question is probably not going to be very well formulated. I'll try and explain what I mean. I've been delving into the audience segmentation of the kind that you showed just now, and when I look at that, I see the way that we are looking at groups of individuals, and yet there's some talk, and you mentioned that today, about to what degree we can consider individuals as responsible for making change. And so I'm just wondering whether you see a discrepancy or a dichotomy there between kind of identifying your audiences as groups of individuals, but at the same time saying is it really individuals that we need to ask to make change, or to what degree do we need to ask individuals to make change, and what kind of change, you know? So, and then I guess the second part of that question is how we go about tipping concern, so that 40% that's concerned or alarmed, into actually action. You know, so we may all be really concerned or alarmed, but then what action do we take as a result? So I don't know if you can answer that, because it's kind of a fuzzy question. So this idea of talking with individuals, segmenting audiences into individuals, and then saying, well, what should individuals do, and how do we get those who are concerned or alarmed to act, and in what ways? Can you tackle that?
So I think I can definitely tackle part of the first question. So the way that you know, I've always seen the behavioural change models is that it depends on where someone's at along that journey, as to what kind of you should be communicating to them. So often with our issue, people are at the beginning where you actually need to provide some kind of information foundation in order for them to then be moving more towards what you're talking about, which is, oh, okay, well, this is actually quite bad and we need to do something about it. So a lot of Climate Council's work is around either identifying gaps in knowledge and trying to fill those with the right information, or identifying problematic attitudes or beliefs and changing them. So that can be something like renewable energy is unreliable, or it could be the you know, Australia's economy is can't survive without the coal and gas industries. It could be the fact that, you know, 30% of people don't actually realize that gas is a fossil fuel. So yeah, we sort of really focus on those kind of things. But other groups do try to focus on, I guess, moving someone from having a particular position on an issue to doing something about it. And often that focus of late has been around their voting, which has had limited success. And I think that's because, you know, people make voting decisions for a bunch of different reasons. And often while they have climate concern, it's not kind of ranking as a primary reason, and they don't necessarily see that their vote will make a difference on that particular issue. And what was the second part of the question? The second part of the question was relating to...
I think you answered that part about tipping concern maybe into action, but this kind of idea of who should we be speaking to as responsible? You know, should you read research papers that say, there's one I was looking at the other day that said 72% of global emissions are under the control of households. And so that kind of, you know, that's an academic paper, but it leads into a narrative of, yes, it's individuals that need to make changes, and not, you know, it's not business. We just provide what you want, you know?
Yeah, I think I think there's
how do you tackle that?
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons, right? Because if you tell people nothing you do matters, as in you can't make the difference, it's disempowering. But likewise, them recycling is not going to fix climate change. Yeah, so I think I would kind of say that it's both. Like, I kind of do agree with people. I think they're kind of right in a sense that there is a mutual responsibility, but avoiding that sort of personal moral guilt is important. So it's like recognizing that there's systematic major things at play that have created a problem, but in terms of solving it, that actually no one can get away with doing nothing, that we all actually can do stuff. which can lead to kind of a positive feeling and sense of achievement, but also that no business, no government can kind of like sit back and put its feet up either. But no, I haven't landed on that entirely, but it's certainly something that I know a few particular groups are trying to tackle.
Yeah, good answer. Thanks very much. That's great. Anyone else have questions?
Yeah, I've got one. Probably more of a comment and a thank you, actually. I work in education and we rely on the council for excellent examples of your communication tools. In the senior sciences, we are moving more towards an infographic, communication-friendly style of reporting on science. And so it's really important that we have key, really well-honed, clever communication tools to offer as examples that deal with this particular topic. Whoops, is my chair gone funny? Because so often it's really hard to find good example or ways of infusing climate change into the curriculum. Many of you may not be aware, we don't have many opportunities through the curriculum to take up climate change thinking. So I think it's a really important opportunity then to maintain those resources that can be taken up by teachers. So I wanted to say thank you. And I guess my question was, you know, how intentional is this? Do you work with educators? Do you think about resources specifically for curriculum application?
We don't, is the short answer, but yeah, awesome to hear that you find things that we've created very useful, because I will pass it on to our research team and they will be super excited. It's not something that we've, I guess, had the capacity for to kind of do, because I think it's, you know, can be pretty specialized. But certainly we see across our desk a number of resourcing that the gas and coal industries kindly provide schools to teach their children. I think there's one area that I think is kind of got good potential for students is pre-bunking. So, you know, I think people love being savvy, particularly young people, and I think equipping them with how they can recognize, you know, where information is coming from, you know, who's putting it out. Yeah, I think is really helpful.
I think the if I could just add on to that too, Leslie Hughes has made herself available a couple of times to talk to groups of mine, and you know, that kind of accessibility, having someone who's a fantastic model, speaks incredibly articulately and uses everyday great examples, infusing science into everyday language is just so key for what we need in schools. I don't think you need to do a lot that's different. Maybe just might be handy to have someone on the team with a little bit of perspective around how to shape some of the tools you're already developing.
Yeah, I will definitely pass that idea on. Leslie's a legend. If you've never seen her work, yeah, we're very lucky to be able to work with people like that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And I saw that Rebecca had posted something in the chat just saying that she was involved in Climate and Health Alliance. So that's lovely. A lot of people have done specific research around health as a lens for, you know, communicating climate. It's a very attractive frame because of the personnel thing that people have when it comes to health, that you automatically individualize it, and also for their families as well. And it's a very highly rated concern up there with economics is health. But there is a lot of communication steps that they have to go through to get from climate change, and then this will harm me or my family, family's health. So yeah, I saw some interesting stuff that Sustainability Victoria did, but yeah, again, a lot of work to do on that one too.
Actually, I read some research a while ago that said that reaching those who are dismissive or unconcerned, if those are the right audience segment names, through a health lens is actually possibly the most productive, because everyone's concerned about health. But as you just said, there are a lot of communicational steps to get there.
Yeah.
So lose them along the way. But that's worth bearing in mind as well. It's not something I've looked into much at all, and I know that Rebecca has. So
yeah, we did. We just had a report we put out earlier this year that was around gas, and that was in partnership with Asthma Australia. And one of the things that they looked at was around the harms of having, gas stovetop in the home, and also schools have gas flue heaters, and the clear evidence around increasing rates of asthma among children, which freaks me out because I rent and I have a gas top stove and I have young children. So yeah, that was incredibly popular from a media perspective, but I think it's a really powerful health example of a specific health kind of message that isn't that kind of broad story of climate and health harm, but kind of breaks it down and into a kind of bite-sized piece.
we've probably got time for one more quick question.
Can I ask one if there's nobody? I have already asked one, so if there was somebody else, of course, I would defer to them. But I just wondered, Dinah, what your thoughts are of the efficacy of local government communications, because I live in Darebin, which is really active in the climate emergency declaration, and I wonder if there's something in sort of the immediacy of the local, and the framing of a particular area as being responsive to climate change, if that works to bring people on board.
Certainly when you're talking climate impacts, the more localized, the more personalized, the better. When you're talking about, I guess, climate solutions, I think that can be just as good. Like if you're kind of saying like this is happening locally, and it just makes it tangible for people and they can visualize it. So I would say definitely. And they have really good reach in terms of like, to every household in their area.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that there's,
So I think Darebin probably is a member of the Cities Power Partnership, but you can go online and check if your council is, if you want to annoy them to join.
Sounds good. Okay, any more questions, anyone? Well, I'm so sorry we started a little bit late, which meant that we probably have missed a little bit of your expertise. But thank you, Dinah, for following up with such a fantastic presentation, really insightful. And luckily we'll have this recorded. So if you're happy with that, we'll put that up on our website as well. It's just such a good summary of where we're at and where we need to be and the kinds of steps we need to take to get there communications wise. So many thanks and much appreciation from me and from all of us, I think.